Hello, everyone from St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. My name is Janet Herron, and I am an Alumni Engagement Officer at Memorial and your host for today's event. I hope you are all well and safe as we live through and move forward through these very strange days. I'm here with writer and Memorial alumnus, Dr. Emily Urquhart. She will be talking about and reading from her book, The Age of Creativity, and revealing some surprising findings on late life stage creativity. I know those of you attending can't see who else is in the room for the event, but we have a full house. We have over 171 registrants and over 80 attendees right now, and more are joining every second. So we are very happy about that. And a reminder that today's event is being recorded. We will begin, as always, with a land acknowledgement.
We respectfully acknowledge the territory in which Memorial St. John's campus is situated as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the island of Newfoundland as the ancestral homelands of the Mi'kmaq and Beothuk. We would also like to recognise the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Nunatuhavut and the Innu of Nitassinan and their ancestors as the original people of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all of the peoples of this province as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation and honour this beautiful land together. Please also recognise the peoples and their ancestors whose ancestral homelands are those on which your own institutions are situated.
Thank you, Dr. Bose. At the Office of Alumni Engagement, we are focused on offering many ways for you to connect with Memorial from anywhere in the world and are working diligently to create opportunities to celebrate, socialize, mentor, learn, and advance both your career and improve your life. Embarking on new and exciting ways to build relationships is vital to our evolution as an institution. You, our alumni and friends, along with our faculty members, are our greatest ambassadors. Together, you encompass a worldwide community of professionals, leaders, and change makers who are advancing the reputation of our university, our province, and our world. You are a worldwide, oh, sorry, I said that already. Please consider getting involved with our programming. There are mentoring opportunities with 10,000 coffees, occasions to meet up with Newfoundland and Labrador expats through Global NL, and Coastlines, our online book club, features Newfoundland and Labrador authors who are also Memorial alumni. You can find more details about all these initiatives on our website, www.mun.ca/alumni. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion about how creativity, both amateur and professional, can sustain people in the third act of their lives. The epigraph of Dr. Urquhart's book sets out her thesis perfectly. When I am 110, everything I do, be it a dot or a line, will be alive. Katsushuki Hokusai. Just a few housekeeping issues. For those new to WebEx, there is a layout button towards the top right-hand side of your screen that gives you options on how to view today's presentation. And a Q&A will follow Dr. Urquhart's formal presentation. I will be monitoring both the chat and the Q&A for your questions. We aren't able to unmute you so you can ask the question yourself, but you can type it in either the chat or the Q&A. Just please try to keep your questions short, and I encourage you to post questions as soon as possible rather than leaving them to the last minute. And a final reminder that this session is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the event in a follow-up email along with some additional resources. It is my very great pleasure to introduce our guest today. Emily Urquhart is a journalist with a doctorate in folklore from Memorial University. Her work has appeared in the Globe and Mail, 18 Bridges, Haikai Magazine, and The Walrus. Her first book, Beyond the Pale, Folklore, Family, and the Mystery of Our Hidden Genes, was a finalist for the Kobo First Book Award, the British Columbia Book Prize, and the BC National Award for Canadian Nonfiction, and was a Globe and Mail Best Book. Her most recent book is The Age of Creativity: Art, Memory, My Father, and Me. It was named a top book of the year by Quill and Quire, CBC, and Now Magazine. She is a nonfiction editor with the New Quarterly and teaches creative nonfiction at Laurier University's Brantford campus. She lives in Kitchener, Ontario with her husband, Dr. Andrew Trant, another Memorial University alumni, and their 2 children. Dr. Urquhart is joining us from the home of her parents in Colborne, Ontario. And now I'm going to pass the ball to Emily, and I am going to mute myself and stop my video.
Okay, thank you so much, Janet, for the intro. It's really so wonderful to be back at MUN, even though it's virtual. I still kind of feel like I'm there. So it's nice. It was being at Memorial and my time in St. John's and in Newfoundland in general was certainly some of the most creative and interesting and important years of my life, actually. So it is nice to come back. I thought what I would do to start this presentation off is to read from the first section of my book. It's from the prologue of The Age of Creativity. The image you have on your screen in front of you, this is just a kind of an illustration to what I'm reading about, which will become clear as I read. It'll be about a 3-minute reading. And the prologue, the title of the prologue is Still Life. I saw the 2 of us framed in the mirror behind the bar. The mirror's surface was smoky and dim, an effect of the candlelight flickering from the tables behind us. There were several rows of glass liquor bottles on the counter below the mirror, as well as a silver-lidded mason jar filled with sugar cubes, a modest pile of white napkins, and a half-peeled lemon in a white porcelain bowl. It was as if we'd stumbled into a modern version of a Flemish still life, those highly realist tableaux of abundance from the 17th century, where iridescent bunches of grapes nestled beside oysters, quivering in their open shells. Half-poured wine sat stilled in glassware that is godlike and shiny, and the gem of a lemon's interior is exposed by its uncurled peel. "Who is that old guy in the mirror?" my father asked. He was winking at himself, at me, at the passage of time. I lifted my phone and captured an image of us. My father at 84, his face thinner than I'd seen it before, his beard as white as his hair, a tan cashmere scarf thrown across his shoulder, and me at 41, half his age, a sweep of brown hair hanging into my eyes, a self-conscious half smile, a string of red beads around my neck. He was looking up, and I was looking down, concentrating on taking the photograph of our reflection, adjusting my lens to include the lemon, the sugar, the white napkins, and the glass bottles, then waiting for a flicker of light to illuminate our faces. The Dutch still lifes were a record of abundance, of wealth. Look at what we've reaped, and of talent, but they also marked an important shift in the story of art. For the first time, there was no discernible subject at the heart of these works. There was no Greek myth, no biblical prophecy. Instead, they were a study of shape and form, light and shadow, and of objects grouped in space. In this way, the Dutch artists took the final steps towards abstraction in art. They created antecedents to larger studies of light in Impressionism, of form in Cubism, of the abstract, non-figurative works that followed from the 19th century onwards. If I looked long enough at these still lifes, I could see my father's abstract expressionist paintings, those towering canvases that were the backdrop of my childhood. These still lifes were not without narrative, however. There was an undercurrent of caution to the works, ever present, always a reminder that the depicted luxuries were ephemeral. No goods could bind the human spirit to earth. The memento mori of these banquet scenes, innocuous, beautifully uncurled, was often the lemon. A peeled fruit will begin to rot. And now, 4 centuries later, here was the peeled lemon, sitting almost aglow in the white bowl on the lip of a bartender's counter. We were living on the fringes of our time of plenty by then, holding on, grasp growing fainter. My father was struggling with his memory, and his pace had slowed, but his work, or rather his vocation, as he called his daily art practice, continued unabated, revealing creativity to be an act as inevitable and constant as death itself. Thank you. Now I'm going to advance to the next slide here, and you can see image that was on your screen before, but now on the left, you can see the photograph that I was writing about in this description. My dad and I are in New York City at this point in 2018. I had planned to do a trip to New York in order to do some research for the book that I was writing that would become The Age of Creativity. So research on aging artists. I had made some appointments to meet with older artists, as well as look at work in galleries and museums. And I was telling my father about all of my plans, and he got his Museum of Modern Art card out of his wallet. He has a lifetime membership. He has work in their collection. And he offered to lend it to me, but only on the condition that I would absolutely return it to him. And it occurred to me at that point that my father clearly thought he was going back to New York. But at this point, although he used to be a big traveler, particularly to look at art, he wasn't traveling on his own anymore and probably wouldn't be again. And so I thought at first that that was maybe a bit sad. And then I thought, well, actually, this is a great opportunity. Why don't we go together? And so I asked him if he would come with me on this research trip, and he said, absolutely. I think he might have been waiting for me to ask. Now, I don't usually have the fortune of knowing exactly when I receive an idea in my head, creative thought, a question that will eventually become a larger project, like a book or an article, or even, a master's or a PhD thesis. But with this book, I actually do. I can pinpoint it to a very specific date and time, and that's September 2016. I had been at a memorial service for a family friend, and afterwards my dad and I went to the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto, which is something we do together all the time, not just at the AGO, but at galleries across North America and also in Europe. We've traveled often together to look at art. So that part wasn't unusual. We went to this gallery space on the second floor. My dad directed me there, and we got into the room, and he looked around and he asked me if I saw any of my friends there, which is a way of asking me, do I recognize the artists who painted these paintings, any of the artists behind the paintings? And sometimes I'm okay with this. I have a degree in art history, and I grew up with my father, so Canadian art was something that was present in my life, but I could never come close to his knowledge. So I did okay. I got 2 of the Quebec artists, which they're not pictured. But then he brought me to the painting pictured on the wall, second from the right, and you can also see that on the left of your screen, a detail of it. And he asked if I knew who painted that. And I said, no, I'm stumped. I have no idea who painted that. But if I had looked a little closer up in the right-hand corner of that painting, I would have seen my father's signature. He was the artist behind that painting. Now, what's unusual about this is that I really, I live with my father's work. I've watched him make his work. It is like a language that I can read. I can always recognize his work in the same way that, you can recognize your parents' handwriting. But in this case, I couldn't. And he went on to critique the work while we were there. He taught for many years as an art history professor, as a fine arts professor. And so he started to kind of critique the painting as if he were giving a critique to a student artist. And the thing is, he was in his early 20s when he made this painting. So in a way, he was giving a critique to a student artist. He felt it hadn't abstracted to the point that his later works would become known for. Now, as he was doing this, a thought occurred to me, and I was surprised by it. I thought, wow, my dad's a better painter in his 80s than he was in his 20s. And right away, I thought that is very strange and how unusual, because the stereotype that we all believe, and that of course I did as well at the time, was that the really, the creative height belongs to the young art stars. That's really when you do your very best work, is when you're young. And that's sort of been the conventional wisdom. And I thought, well, wait a second, maybe he's really unusual in this way, that he could be a better painter in his 80s than he could be in his 20s. And then I thought, and had another thought, that maybe actually he was just ordinary, just like everyone else. Why would creativity fade in old age? And I also wanted to know where that idea came from. What was it that made us believe that creativity would decline as we aged, as we got older? And so I had those thoughts in that gallery space, and I was immediately excited by them. I saw a research project ahead of me, so much so that when I said goodbye to my dad that day and I got on the GO train to go back to my home where I lived in Kitchener, I spent that time on my phone doing as much research as possible. Now, since then, I've done more research than just pecking away on my smartphone. And one of the most surprising findings to come out of my research on aging and creativity was that a lot of our stereotypes, and certainly the ones that have been perpetuated in the media, are tied to one seminal study. This was undertaken in the 1950s by a psychologist named Harvey Lehman, and it was called Age and Achievement. And what Lehman did was look at artists' careers in 5-year increments. He looked at all sorts of artists, visual artists, poets, architects, but for our purposes today, because I'm talking about visual art, that's where I'll stick to that lane. He looked at these artists' careers over 5-year periods, and he looked at how many sort of hits or mentions, citations that their work got in textbooks or encyclopedias. To say how creative they were, and he noticed that there was a decline as the artists got older and came to the conclusion that that must mean that we are less creative as we age. Now, there are a number of problems with this study, which I'll go into, but I can tell you that media outlets continue to cite that study as an example of solid evidence that our creativity declines as we age, and it is just simply not true and has been debunked. And there's been a lot of research put into creativity and aging since that says the opposite of what Lehman's study says. I think the last time I saw it quoted, though, was in a National Geographic article on genius published only a few years ago, even though this study came from the 50s. So there are a lot of problems with this study, one being that in the 1950s, what Lehman was working with, these were artists who were appearing in textbooks and encyclopedias. And so they were mainly Western artists. They were, even when I studied art history in the late 90s and early 2000s, they were all men. Maybe there were a few women in the really contemporary sections of my textbooks, but obviously Lehman wouldn't have had access to that. There were no artists of color. So right away, we're taking out a giant swath of the population and basing our ideas of creativity on those findings. But I think also we have to consider that right away it disadvantages the older artists if they are not getting attention or their work sold in the later years of their lives. Sometimes artists do slow down. There are natural, health issues or just with natural aging process that might mean that your output is slower. There's also, which I found with my father, the problem where artists never retire, but all the people who are in the business of selling art are the gatekeepers who tell you which art is important and who should buy what, and the gallery owners, the curators. Well, there's a really big personnel shift for older artists, and that's just because those people retire, and as they should, or they die. So the older artists are still trying to work with a new cohort of people who are trying to make their own mark, which in some ways is fair enough, and they're trying to make their own roster of artists, and they've lost interest. So a study like Lehman's would immediately disadvantage older artists. The other problem, though, and this is something I really feel strongly about, is that I don't believe that create is a noun. It's a verb. To create is an action. It is something that you do. It shouldn't be tied to a product necessarily. So an act of creativity could be the way you follow the light across the sky with your gaze. It could be how you arrange the knickknacks on your mantle. It could be the idea you have that eventually becomes a painting or a novel or a piece of dialogue in that novel. But it doesn't have to be tied to something solid that can be basically boxed and sold. And so I think that's one of the big problems we have with studying creativity, is that in some ways I think it's actually impossible. You can't quantify it. There are so many ways to be creative. So there have been studies since. One term that came up in the 1960s is crystallized intelligence. And that is that sort of cumulative well of knowledge and skill and talent, and just what comes with working on your craft for decades and decades of your life. You get to a point where you have this crystallized intelligence and you have so much to offer and give. And with many artists, this is where they're going to be at the top of their game. And one other thing I want to say about aging and creativity that's positive is that I did come across at least one study that suggested the thinning of the frontal cortex, which is a naturally happens in the aging process, is associated with fewer inhibitions, which means that people don't care as much what other people think, basically, which as a creative person myself, I know that is really a huge barrier. Is when you start to think, you know, as a writer, when I start to think about how people might react to what I'm doing, well, there's nothing worse than than trying to create after that. You're kind of dead on the water. So that, you know, if naturally we are feeling less inhibited, then I think we are going to be more creative. Now, I wanted to show this image because it gives you a good idea of how I might be uniquely positioned to have observed the arc of an artist's career. In this case, my father's, from when he was in his probably mid-40s in this image here, up to when he was in his 80s. This is from a Harbourfront Centre in Toronto. It was a special day for artists and their children that my brothers and I took part in with my father. So we didn't normally have professional photographers around as I watched my dad make art. But it's a great image because it shows basically what I did a lot of during my childhood, watching my dad. He's pulling a print off a printing press here, but I watched him make his sculptures and his drawings and his paintings. And if you wanted to spend time with my dad, that's what you had to do. You either had to watch him or join him. And a lot of the time I also joined him, which then gave me a sort of a unique and sort of long period to draw from when I was writing my book about aging and creativity. One of the ideas that I quickly realized I needed to address was that you can't just look at the last stage of an artist's life. You have to look at the arc of their career if you're going to write about their aging and their creativity. This slide is, it has a dual purpose. The first purpose is to show how later in life I also traveled with my father. Well, I say later in life, I mean when I was in my late teens and early 20s, and I didn't have the kind of responsibilities I have now with children. And I often accompanied my father on his yearly trips to Europe. He went every year to draw. You can see him in the bottom left corner there. He's sitting in Ronda, Spain. It's a beautiful hilltop town that he liked to visit and draw at. And there he is sitting and drawing. And then above that image of my father sitting on the top left, you can see what it is that he's sketching. This is from 2000. And then again, on the right side, you can see there's an image I took from an inn we were staying at. And below that, you can see the drawing my father made of that same view. Now, this is the beginning of the creative process for him, where he'll do a sketch in outside and in the situation, in the landscape, but it'll be quick and it won't be exact, because then he takes it back home with him at the end of his trip, all these sort of quick, not exact sketches, and he would never work from a photograph afterwards. But what he does, and some of you, maybe if you have an iPad and you can really zoom in, you may be able to see that in both of the drawings on this slide, in all four corners, you can see a tiny pinprick. And that's because my dad pinned all of his works to a corkboard that faced his place at the kitchen table, which he has done all his life and he continues to do. When I was a child, the majority of my childhood, the house we lived in, the corkboard was enormous. It was, 4 feet tall and 5 feet across and covered in drawings. And there was a little round table that was pushed up against it. And I sat across from my mother and my dad sat across from his art. And he had a really specific purpose, and it was harnessing that sort of unconscious creativity The way I like to describe it in my life anyhow is I will often be trying to work on something, an article or a book, some piece of writing, and it's not working, and there's a problem and I don't know what the problem is, and then I go away from it and I have to make dinner and do all the dishes afterwards, and I'll be, elbow deep in the dishwasher water, and then the solution comes, or the creative idea comes that will lead to that solution. So my father tried to harness that by putting his drawings that were in progress in front of him while he ate, so he could be considering them, but he wasn't actively at his artwork. Now, when I was a child, he told me that there was a small fairy, he called her the good fairy, who would visit those drawings overnight, and she would make changes to those drawings. And of course, I imagined this small being with wings and maybe a satchel over her shoulder filled with pens and pencils, going around and making different marks and changing my father's work. But the reality is that it was just that my father was seeing them in new ways because he was looking at them in new ways. And so, or maybe there was a good fairy. I don't know. The jury's out on that. Now, I chose this slide very specifically, as you'll see, with a mason jar in the middle that says Middle Cove, Newfoundland, St. John's on the top there. My dad's drawings in progress would sometimes go on to become finished drawings. Sometimes they would go on to become paintings, and often they went on to be the basis for his sculptures. And he called these sculptures, all of them, boxes. They're kind of like 3D curio cabinets with strange landscapes inside, and they all sit on a box like this, and they're on hinges. You are meant to open them and look inside, although you will get in trouble if you do that in the art gallery, because I have been with my father when he has done it himself, and he gets in trouble for doing it. But the intention is actually that you are supposed to be able to move this piece of art around and change it to your liking. This particular piece, I chose it for two reasons. One, because it's a later box. It's one of his latest, actually, and he was already in his 80s, I think, by the time, 81 maybe, by the time he made this box. But also because it is spackled in small pebbles from Middle Cove Beach. And this is from when I lived in St. John's. I was there for 6 years, and my father came to visit at some point. I don't remember which visit it was, but we walked the dog at Middle Cove, and he saw the small rocks near the break of the waves, and he was really taken with them and asked if I'd help him take some home, which might be illegal. I hope not. Anyhow, this is a better view of what he eventually did with those small stones. He spackled the outside of his box with them, this box of keys. It's also in this image where you can see what it looks like when you open it up. Now I'm going to move on to other artists who exemplify that late stage creativity that I wanted to look at in this book and in the research for this book. I have an image here of Claude Monet's Water Lilies. I like to use Monet as an example because even if you don't have a great interest in visual art, you will often have at least heard of Monet's name, and also in conjunction with his name, his Water Lilies series. And what's interesting about the Water Lilies is that he made this series in the final years of his life, and they were his magnum opus. It was really, he was working in a hurry, and he knew he was getting older, and he knew what he wanted to achieve, and he did. It's really remarkable. And also that I think it's a great example of that crystallized intelligence I was speaking about earlier, where someone who's been working at their craft for so long, who has this incredible talent and knowledge to draw on from all those years of painting and looking at the light and how it reflects on the water, and he knew what he wanted to achieve, and I think we can agree that he managed to achieve what he set out to do. This next slide here is Mont Saint-Victoire by French artist Paul Cezanne. Cezanne also created this work in, I believe it was the last year of his life. I think he did die in 1906. He actually died, well, initially, he fell down while painting en plein air, trying to capture Mont Saint-Victoire. And he did this often. He painted this view over and over and over again because he was trying to achieve something, and he was learning something new every day with what he was setting out to do. And the reason I am showing you this slide is that I wanted to talk a little bit about the types of creativity. I had the privilege really of speaking quite a few times with an economist named David Galenson. He's an economist, but he is also a brilliant art historian. He is both. And he turned his powers, his economist powers, towards art to look at creativity. He was interested in knowing if there were just more about creativity, but he also felt that Harvey Lehman's study, the one where he just looked at whatever hits came in the textbook, he felt that that study was well, bunk in his terms. And also he had heard people talk about how older artists have a particular style. This is something that I came across in my research as well, a late style, meaning that across the board, no matter what their backgrounds were, what kind of art they made, older artists had a certain style that they followed. I also don't agree with that. David Galenson felt, after studying a huge swath of the last probably 400 years of art history, that there were two types of creativity rather than a late style or an early style. And that is that there is a type of artist who is an experimental artist, like Paul Cezanne, and also like my father, who works in series. The way my dad describes it is, if you do 9 drawings of a horse, you're going to learn something from each of those drawings. So by the time you get to the 10th drawing, you can take everything you learned from those other drawings and apply it to that final work. And this is, I believe, how Paul Cezanne was working as well. And so Galen says those kind of artists are experimental artists. The other type are conceptual, meaning like Andy Warhol or Picasso, where you get an idea in your head and you're able to execute it immediately, just as it appeared to you, just as that spark appeared to you. And what he found, interestingly, was that there's the artists who tended to do their best work late in life were experimental artists. So like Paul Cezanne and like Monet, and also like my father. An interesting look at creativity. Here we have a self-portrait by Alice Neel. She's an American, or she was an American portrait artist. Her portraits were different than what you would normally see. You know, she didn't do commissions for wealthy people or politicians. She liked to paint real people. I mean, sometimes she painted famous people like Andy Warhol, but she was more interested in capturing the sort of the human spirit, and she was more abstract as well. This portrait of herself, her self-portrait, was done with a mirror. She was actually left-handed. That's why we know that. She's holding her brush in her right hand here. It's one of my favorite self-portraits. It's really innovative. Up until that point, someone might prove me wrong on this point, but I do not think that there has been any other 80-year-old artist, which is the age she's at right now in this portrait, who depicted themselves nude. And so it was audacious, this step. I also love it because of her expression. If you look at the way she's looking out at the viewer with that raised eyebrow, I feel that she's saying, you know, do you have a problem with this? Because I don't. And if you have a problem with this, it says more about you. She's very provocative, but she's also very progressive. And this is one of her best known works. And she was 80 when she painted it. This is a painting by Georgia O'Keefe. She was in her 80s when she made this. It's her last unassisted oil painting. And what that means is that she didn't go on to paint any more works without help from a studio assistant. And this was because her eyesight was failing and she was having trouble working with paint because of that. Her biographers looked at this and looked at the title, which is The Beyond, and they felt that she was looking towards the afterlife, really the end. And that is not how I feel about this painting. I feel like this is a painting that is looking towards something new and something different. Maybe it's looking towards a change. Certainly she would know that her eyesight was going, but maybe she was thinking of what to do next. And the reason I think that is, here is 12 years later, now she's in her 90s, Georgia O'Keefe, and she's sitting here perched on a large sculpture that she created either in her late 80s or early 90s. And so what she did when her eyesight was failing was that she just went and returned to sculpture. So she had done some sculpture work throughout her career, but then she started working exclusively in sculpture because the textile, the sort of nature of making sculptural works worked with her vision at that time in her life, and she created some amazing work. So I just don't buy that the beyond was her looking to the end. I think she was looking towards what to do next. Here I'm returning to my father's work. My father also, I mean, the realities of aging, they exist. So for my father, he can't make his huge paintings that he used to because he just can't lift them. He doesn't have the strength. Just as Georgia O'Keeffe couldn't continue painting because she couldn't see the way she used to. Here we have great Uncle Milton's war chest, which is actually just our coffee table, basically, in my living room. And my father, when he was visiting us in Victoria, BC, which is where I moved after living in St. John's, but before moving to Kitchener. And my father was visiting and he didn't want to go out and draw in the landscape, which, as I've shown you in earlier images in this presentation, is something that he did quite regularly. So it seemed strange to me. And I was a bit worried. He was in his late 70s at the time, and I wondered why. Was he worried about getting lost, or what was the problem? But he was happy. He just wanted to sit on our couch and he wanted to draw Uncle Milton's war chest. And my dad's always been weird, so I just let that happen. But the truth was, he saw something in that chest that nobody else could. So 5 months later, when I went to visit him at my parents' house in Colborne, where I am now, there was a huge oil painting. This is the painting on your right here, over the fireplace. And he told me, well, there you go. There's Uncle Milton's war chest. So what I thought was, a limitation, he wasn't able to go outside, or he didn't want to, or something was happening, was just another form of creativity. Sometimes I think that limitations are in some ways necessary for creativity, certainly for progress. And my dad definitely progressed with the strong box. It became a series, actually. There are 3 of these paintings out there. And he also started using a color pink that I'd never seen in his work before, which another interesting change, innovation, progress in his later years as a painter. This is my dad's drawing desk. It's funny, where I'm sitting now, I'm in my mom's workroom, and my dad's workroom is just across the way. But anyhow, this is actually from August 2020. My dad was, again, not painting as much, not doing as much oil painting or sculpture work as he was getting older. And so he went to a room in my parents' house that he called the drawing room, which really is the room where he draws. And this is his drawing table. And he started working exclusively with works on paper because that was achievable for him. It worked nicely. And he also enjoyed the view just out the window there, which you can maybe kind of see. There's an old barn. That's what we're looking at here. And then I'll get to the next slide. And then what he's also looking at is this tree, and below it, statue of St. Francis, and just above St. Francis, there's the bird feeder, which is cylindrical, squirrel-proof bird feeder. So last summer, I visited my dad, and I looked at the cork board, as I always do, to see what he's been up to. And I saw the 4 long, thin drawings that are on the left. And I wondered what they were. I thought they looked a little, maybe religious. I didn't know, or something, some kind of organ. And he does have a large collection of of postcards that he's collected from his years visiting art galleries and religious spots in Europe. So I wondered if that's what inspired it, but no, he told me, no, you just look out my drawing room window, you'll see that actually it was the squirrel-proof bird feeder that inspired my father. And so it's just another example of, we've all been sequestered inside, and we've all been looking at the same view. And for him in particular, being an older person, he's really been quite isolated during this whole pandemic. And so his view hasn't changed much, but he will see a different view every day in the same way that Cezanne saw a different Mont Saint Victoire every day. So in his, and similarly with the trunk. I wanted to share this image of my father with my two children. This is last summer. He is giving them a watercolor instruction lesson. And I thought it was another great example of the importance of older people in our lives in general. I have to say that I spent a lot of time with my father in the studio, and I made a lot of art beside him, and I watched him make a lot of art, but he never would have taken the time like this to show me how to make something. And that's really kind of a grandparent thing, because he would have been in the throes of his career and working hard, and maybe or maybe it's just a grandparent thing in general, that you take that time with your grandchildren that you just don't necessarily have with your own children. So I thought it was another great example of how important the elders are in our life. And this is my final slide. It is also from last summer. My book came out on September 1st. And as we all know, there's no parties, no one was allowed to gather, but that was okay because the guest of honor was able to celebrate with me. And so my dad and my mom and my husband and my kids, we had our own party. And and really that's what mattered most with this book, was that my dad be there, be a part of it, as he had been throughout the whole process. And I'm really grateful to have been able to spend this extra time with him, learning from him and interviewing him at this stage in his life. And he's really given me a great gift that I hope I can manage to pass on. And that is the knowledge that we stay creative throughout our lives. It doesn't decline. It is just something that we carry with us as we go. Thanks.
Thank you, Emily. Here, I'm just going to take the ball back from you. You can have a drink.
Yeah.
But that was wonderful. Thank you so much for that amazing and informative presentation. I love the phrase crystallized intelligence. I'm going to use that on my dad.
It's a good one. I agree.
It really is good.
I can't wait to get there.
Exactly. I'd like to actually take this opportunity before we go on to the Q&A. I'd like to thank Johnson Insurance for their ongoing support of our professional and personnel development series. And as you can see here, Johnson offers Memorial University alumni specially designed policies and preferred rates on home and car insurance. Okay, so that was our brief commercial moment, and now we are going to go into the Q&A. I have a question already, but I don't have a lot of questions, so people don't be shy. Post them in the chat or the Q&A. But the first question is a great one, and I look forward to your answer, Emily. It's from Holly Everett, and she asks if in your research you found connections between older age, illness, and creativity. She has had experience with a loved one who was urgently driven to create due to having terminal cancer. That's really interesting.
That is a very interesting, and also, hi, Holly. In some ways I did, I found, like, Monet is a good example of that. His health was failing and he knew the end was near. And so he was driven to create. I don't think he had a specific illness. I can't remember now, but I know that he was very aware of his own mortality at that part in his life. And certainly there have been some illnesses that have opened creativity. I did find a study about a woman who suffered from Parkinson's, actually, but discovered that she was a very creative painter, which she had never done in her life. She had never done any artwork, any visual art at all. And she was driven to paint and to make these amazing paintings. And she got to be quite famous. And this was as a result of her Parkinson's. This is how it was framed. I'm not sure. I guess you could also maybe wonder if it was an urge to create, because she knew she had this disease that would ultimately be terminal. So I have come across it, definitely, and I think there is something there where you have an illness that either spurs something that you've never ever considered before, or makes you think, well, I think I want to finish this. There's something important here. Yeah.
Okay, and here's another question here from Joanne Mercer. She's wondering about people coming to creativity as something new as they get older. Have you heard or researched that?
Yes, and yeah, and in some ways, my research, I don't even know if I would call it that. Once people start to hear that you are interested in a topic, then you start to hear a lot of anecdotal research, just inadvertently in some ways. But what I heard from so many people who said that retirement provided a really fertile space for them to be creative. And actually, I didn't talk about this in the talk, but a lot of older women artists are now getting their due. And when I say older, I mean they are like late 90s, 100 years old, and they're getting, their first one-woman show with the Whitney. And this is, I think, well, I know it is tied to being a caregiver, a lifelong caregiver. So if you have all these dependents and people dependent on you, in some cases, actually, it was also due to having a husband who was also an artist, just didn't quite jive with the husband to have the woman get any attention. And these older women right now too, actually, would be about people not letting them show in their galleries when they, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But in any case, a lot of people find that now, as they grow older, if they have retired, then they have this space and time, and that is really such a fertile period for creativity. Just even having the blank space of your mind, and to have those ideas that maybe have been there forever suddenly bubble up, and you think, well, maybe actually I'm going to try hooking a rug and maybe I'll be good at it, or I'm going to try making paintings, maybe I'll be good at, or even smaller outputs like gardening, or just uh, even bird watching. I think bird watching is a creative act. There are just so many ways to be creative, and I do think that once you are allowed the time and space, and really, it's really just a place for your imagination to roam. So yeah, definitely, that I've heard so many stories about people becoming, starting something totally new in the third act of their life, and being really successful, and being really really satisfied by it too.
Wonderful. Such a positive message. You've got a question from Kevin Keogh, and he's asking if you have, oh my God, now the questions are coming in fast and furious. Just one second. Have you had the opportunity to study creativity among scientists during the aging process?
No, but my husband, being a scientist, likes to always make sure to let me know that science is a very creative discipline as well. So no, I haven't, but I think that would be really interesting, because I think those kind of creative ideas, when I was talking about my dad and the cork board, and that the unconscious solutions that come to our problems, again, anecdotally, I've heard from people, I heard from a scientist recently, actually, who felt that they related, he's an older scientist, and he related to a lot of what I wrote about in my book in terms of creativity. So I haven't personally, but I think there's some fertile ground there, certainly.
We've got a question from Roger Sarter, who's asking about memory for detail, and he's fascinated about experimental artists working to perfect the detail in a scene they've returned to many times. His interest is in writing, where similarly, the key is in keeping a grip on a mass of detail. But does the fading of short-term memory with age create difficulties for this?
It can, yeah. So my father has dementia, and in the early stages before he had his diagnosis, he was finding it frustrating, because he would look at the corkboard and he would have this idea, but then he had to carry that idea all the way to his studio, and sometimes by the time he got there, it would be gone, and that was frustrating. But he also felt like the corkboard kind of act as an aid memoir for memory. So that it was helpful in some ways to always have it in front of you in that way. But yeah, memory, it can be a real challenge if you're having short-term memory issues, to hold on to that image that you're trying to build, whether it's in writing or whether it is in visual art or poetry or whatever. Yeah.
Here's a question. Emily, can you speak on how your own age contributed to this creative process for you? In other words, do you think your conversations and insights would have been different if you'd worked on this project 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I actually, when I set out to write about this topic, it began first as an article in the Walrus magazine. And I did wonder about my position as someone in their 40s, whether I could really fully understand what creativity might look like for somebody in their 80s. But having a background in journalism, I finally decided that, you know what, I've reported on issues that are far way more outside my expertise, and I think if you do enough reporting and you listen enough, that hopefully you'll get close to what you want to achieve. But at the same time, I have thought about that. I wondered if I wrote this book when I myself was in my 80s, what would it look like? Well, I could certainly write from the first person perspective. that would help. That would give it a different angle for sure. And maybe I might look back on this and say like, oh God, you thought you knew what you're talking about then. And because we learn so much as we age that there's a good chance I will do that. But at the same time, I have heard from older artists who were happy to hear that somebody who wasn't an older artist was writing about this topic. It somehow gave it more validity, like it's an interesting topic and it should be looked at, and it's not just me trying to tell you about what's happening in my personal life, I guess.
Here's a great question from Liz Batstone. She's asking, this is great. As a 75-year-old in the midst of doing an MFA in creative nonfiction at King's University, I find most people are amazed that someone my age would do this. And why? Are we a society that conditions us to believe that when we retire, we should sit in a rocking chair and do nothing challenging? Any research on why we buy into this?
Well, I think it just goes back to it's a stereotype. It's a stereotype, and those studies certainly didn't help anything. The ones that we're still drawing on today about how, you know, we have a very concrete age that creativity declines for, you know, in that early study there was poets, God, they lasted till 30 according to Harvey Lehman, and then it was over, and we know that's not true. So I think it's just a really bad stereotype. And I think also it seems to me that we don't really value the older people in our lives as we should. I think we've seen that in a really horrific and upsetting manner over the past year and a half, and I think it's something that absolutely needs to change. I just also want to mention about the MFA when you're 75. I think that's the perfect time to do an MFA. Why not? And the people I know, I'm sure people are telling you, as they were saying about my father in his 80s, they were starting to say that he was remarkable. And I sensed that they weren't saying that because of his talent so much as the fact that he was continuing to be creative after 80. And people are well-meaning, you know, they're just trying to tell you that oh, look at you, you're amazing. But it is pretty condescending. And I think we have to start to pay attention to that and really turn our ideas around about aging in general, but certainly aging in creativity.
Absolutely. Got a comment popped up here from Jackie Alcott. She says she was 50 when she went for her BFA and have not looked back. My work is changing all the time. And Holly Everett comments that she really appreciates your emphasis on creativity as an act or a process rather than focusing on products as evidence of creativity. Yeah, and I don't think we have any more questions right now, but people shouldn't be shy. Susan Hines, another comment, she says that this was a lovely presentation, thank you, and just wanted to say that she looks forward to her retirement so she can be more creative.
Excellent.
Which is great. I think one of the things that when I read the book, I just loved the book, and there was one particular quote that really stood out to me. And for those of you who haven't read the book, this is it. The fundamental misunderstanding of our time, maybe of all time, is that we belong to one age group or another. Barring illness or injury, we will all grow old. There is no us and them. And that really resonated for me. I mean, I've been, you know, my parents are elderly and they're in Toronto, and I talk to them often on Zoom. And I remember my mother saying when she just recently had a birthday, and she still feels, she says, I feel like someone made a mistake. I feel like I'm 18. And it's because she's the same person. Of course, people change and they grow, and but they are, I think, maybe essentially the same people. And that's something that we have to wrap our brains around.
Yeah.
Any other questions out there? If there's no other questions, I don't think so. That's great. Okay. We will then, I'm just going to pull up our final slide. And Emily, did you have anything that final thoughts that you might want to leave our listeners or our watchers with?
Yeah, actually, you know, bringing up the idea that there was ever an us and them, I think that's an important important idea to leave off on, is that I think people, it's really a failure of imagination on the part of the young to think that they will never be old. And I think it's very hard for people to imagine it, but I think we need to try harder, because it's true. I mean, if we are lucky, we will all grow old. And so we're all going to go through that process, and we should really consider that as we're living the rest of our lives as well.
Absolutely. So on behalf of Memorial University's Office of Alumni Engagement, I would like to sincerely thank Dr. Urquhart for her time and for sharing her observations on aging and creativity. And a reminder for those of you who are watching and who have not yet purchased a copy of the book, the Memorial University bookstore does have some copies still available at a special discounted price of just over $18. So that's great to know, and it's a wonderful book, and I highly recommend it. I've got my copy here. So we've all learned a lot today. I think it was a wonderful, wonderful book, Emily. You're one of those alumni that are, you know, you're our greatest ambassador. So thank you so much. And I think that, you know, as we've just saying, conversations about rethinking aging are very, very important for all of us right now, especially when we keep hearing this very negative messaging about the declining population, and as if
Absolutely.
Anyway, we won't get into any of that. So thanks again
so
for
much.
all of you out there. Sorry, you can say thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. And those are our upcoming events, so people can register for those on our website. This session has been recorded, so everyone who's attending will receive a follow-up email in their inbox with a recording of the event, which you can watch and share with others. And because it's an important message, and I think that I just thank you so much for all attending, and that's it, and we'll see you the next time.